The scorching Arizona sun bore down on the wooden auction platform where Julia Morgan stood with her wrists bound behind her back, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. At 22, she never imagined she'd be merchandise, priced and sold like cattle after the stagecoach attack that had left her the lone survivor. The year was 1876, and in this lawless corner of the territory, human decency seemed as scarce as water in the desert. "500 for the pretty little thing," a bearded man shouted from the crowd, his yellow teeth bared in what passed for a smile. Julia flinched as the auctioneer grabbed her chin, forcing her face up. "Look at this fine specimen, gentlemen, educated too, from back east. Imagine the uses you could put her to." Laughter rippled through the crowd of miners, drifters, and ranch hands. Julia closed her eyes, unable to bear their hungry stares. 3 weeks ago, she'd been teaching children in Boston, dreaming of adventure in the West. Now she prayed merely to survive the day. 700, called another voice. 8, shouted a third. The bidding continued, each increase driving Julia deeper into despair. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she contemplated the fate awaiting her. The stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies assaulted her nostrils as the men pressed closer to the platform. $1,000. The crowd fell silent at the new bid, significantly higher than the previous offers. Julia's eyes flew open. At the back of the gathering stood a tall figure, partially obscured by shadow. He stepped forward and the crowd parted reluctantly. The man who emerged was unlike the others. Dust covered his worn leather chaps and denim shirt, but he carried himself with quiet authority. A cowboy hat shadowed piercing blue eyes in a sun-weathered face. A star-shaped badge glinted on his chest. "I said 1,000, he repeated, voice level but carrying enough steel to silence the muttering that had begun. "Any other bids?" The auctioneer looked surprised but pleased by the high offer. "Going once, going twice, wait just a minute," interrupted a heavyset man in an expensive suit. "I'll go 1,200. Julia recognized him as Silas Blackwell, the owner of the largest saloon in town, and a man with a reputation that made her blood run cold. Stories about what happened to women in his establishment circulated even on stagecoaches passing through. The cowboy's jaw tightened as he assessed Blackwell. Without breaking eye contact, he said, 1,500. Blackwell's face darkened. 2,000. A murmur swept through the crowd. Such sums were rarely seen in these parts, especially not for a woman. The cowboy didn't hesitate. 3,000. The crowd gasped. That was enough to buy a decent ranch. Blackwell's face flushed with anger. "You can't possibly have that kind of money, Parker." The cowboy Parker removed a leather pouch from inside his vest and tossed it to the auctioneer. "Count it." The auctioneer's eyes widened as he verified the contents. $3,000, Mr. Blackwell. Do I hear more?" Blackwell glared at Parker, then at Julia. For a terrible moment, she thought he would raise the bid further, but he spat in the dust and turned away. "She ain't worth it. Sold." The auctioneer declared, pocketing a substantial commission before handing the remaining money to the leader of the men who had captured Julia. Parker approached the platform with measured steps. Up close, Julia could see faint lines around his eyes, evidence of years squinting into the sun. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s. "Turn around," he told her, his voice quieter now. Julia hesitated, fear coursing through her veins. What had she been sold into? But with no options, she slowly turned her back to him. She felt his presence behind her, then the cool touch of a knife against her wrists. With a quick movement, he cut through the ropes that bound her. The sudden freedom made Julia stumble. Parker caught her elbow to steady her, then immediately released her once she found her footing. "She belongs with me," he announced to the lingering crowd, his voice carrying authority despite its softness. Then, more quietly, for her ears alone, "Only if you want to, miss. I'm Marshal Preston York. I can take you somewhere safe." Julia stared at him, rubbing her raw wrists, trying to comprehend what was happening. This man had just spent a fortune to buy her, only to offer her freedom. "Why?" she whispered. "Because no person should be bought or sold," he answered simply. "Now come, we shouldn't linger." He offered his arm but didn't touch her again, waiting for her to make the choice. After a moment's hesitation, Julia placed her trembling hand on his forearm. Together, they walked away from the auction platform, past the disappointed onlookers, toward a chestnut mare tethered nearby. Julia could feel Blackwell's eyes burning into her back as Preston helped her onto the horse before mounting behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a protective circle without actually touching her. "Hold on," he murmured, and then they were moving, dust swirling in their wake as they rode away from the hellish scene. Julia clung to the saddle horn, her mind reeling with everything that had happened. The nightmare of the stagecoach attack, being captured, the days spent bound and afraid, the auction block, and now this unexpected rescue. "Where are we going?" she finally asked as the town receded behind them. "My cabin. It's about an hour's ride from here." "You'll be safe there tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out what you want to do next." His voice came from just behind her ear, steady and reassuring. The desert landscape stretched out before them, painted in hues of amber and gold by the late afternoon sun. For the first time in days, Julia felt something other than terror. It wasn't quite hope, she was too cautious for that, but perhaps the beginning of it. "I'm Julia," she said after a long silence. "Julia Morgan. Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Morgan." She couldn't see his face, but she thought she heard a smile in his voice. "Most folks just call me Preston." Julia nodded, exhaustion suddenly washing over her now that the immediate danger had passed. She found herself leaning back slightly, her body seeking support. "Rest if you need to," Preston said gently. "I've got you." Hesitantly, Julia allowed herself to relax against his solid presence. As the horse's steady gait lulled her, she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since the attack, surrounded by the unfamiliar yet comforting scent of leather, horses, and the promise of safety. Preston kept the mare at a steady pace, alert for any signs of pursuit. He doubted Blackwell would come after them. The man had too much pride for that, but in this territory, you couldn't be too careful. Especially not with someone as precious as the woman now sleeping against his chest. He hadn't planned on attending the auction. Word had reached him that morning about a special item being sold, and something in his gut told him to investigate. When he saw Julia standing there, bound and terrified but still holding herself with dignity, something inside him had broken and mended all at once. There had been no question of what he needed to do. The shadows lengthened across the desert as they rode, and Preston knew they'd reach his cabin just before nightfall. It wasn't much, a simple two-room structure with basic furnishings, but it was clean and secure. More importantly, it was far from town and the kind of men who thought women could be bought and sold. Julia stirred as the terrain began to change, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub pine and juniper. "Where are we?" she murmured, voice thick with sleep. "Almost there." "Just over this ridge." She straightened, putting a proper distance between them again, and Preston respected her need for space. As they crested the hill, his cabin came into view in the small valley below, a thin wisp of smoke still rising from the chimney from the fire he'd banked that morning. "You live here alone?" Julia asked. "Just me and a few horses," Preston confirmed. "Town's a half-day's ride, which suits me fine." He guided the mare down the slope toward the cabin. A small corral stood adjacent to a modest barn, where two other horses raised their heads in greeting as they approached. When they reached the yard, Preston dismounted first, then offered Julia his hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. As her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled. Preston caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist. "Easy," he said softly. "When's the last time you ate anything?" Julia's brow furrowed. "Yesterday, maybe the day before." Her voice was barely audible. "They didn't feed us much." A flash of anger crossed Preston's face before he controlled it. "Let's get you inside. I'll fix something while you rest." The cabin was simply furnished but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a rocking chair and small sofa placed before it. A wooden table with 4 chairs occupied the other side, near a modest kitchen area. A closed door presumably led to the bedroom. "Sit," Preston said, gesturing to the sofa as he stoked the fire back to life. "I'll get you some water." Julia sank onto the sofa, her body suddenly reminding her of every bruise and ache from her ordeal. She watched as Preston moved efficiently around the cabin, filling a cup with water from a pitcher, then gathering ingredients for a meal. "Thank you," she said as he handed her the water. She drank deeply, not realizing how parched she'd been. "Don't thank me for basic decency," he replied, his voice gruff. He knelt by the fireplace, adding wood to build up the heat before moving to the stove. Julia observed him as he worked, trying to understand this man who had spent a fortune to free her. He moved with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin, his actions deliberate and measured. There was a quietness to him that contrasted sharply with the brutal chaos she'd experienced over the past days. "You're a marshal?" she finally asked, remembering the badge she'd glimpsed earlier. Preston nodded without turning from the stove where he was heating a pan. "Territorial marshal. My jurisdiction covers a fair piece of ground out here." "Then why didn't you just arrest them? For selling people?" His shoulders tensed slightly. "Law's complicated in these parts. Those men claimed they rescued you from Apaches and were entitled to compensation." He glanced back at her, his expression dark. "I knew that was a lie, but proving it would have been another matter. Sometimes the fastest way to justice isn't the official route." He returned his attention to the food, adding ingredients to the pan. "Besides, by the time I got there, the auction had already started. Intervening would have caused a firefight, putting you in more danger." The aroma of cooking meat and beans filled the cabin as Preston worked. Julia's stomach growled audibly, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. "It's nothing fancy," Preston said as he brought her a plate several minutes later. "Bean stew with bacon and cornbread from this morning." To Julia, it looked like a feast. She thanked him and began eating, trying to pace herself despite her hunger. Preston served himself a smaller portion and sat in the rocking chair, giving her space. They ate in comfortable silence until Julia had scraped her plate clean. Only then did she ask the question that had been nagging at her since they'd left town. $3,000 is a lot of money," she said quietly. "Why would you pay that much for a stranger?" Preston set his empty plate aside, his gaze fixed on the fire. For a long moment, Julia thought he might not answer. "My sister," he finally said, his voice low. "Elizabeth, she was taken by raiders 5 years ago. By the time I found out where they'd sold her, it was too late." His jaw tightened. "I swore I'd never let it happen to another woman if I could help it." "I'm so sorry," Julia whispered, understanding now the pain she'd glimpsed in his eyes. Preston nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "You should rest. You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly take your bed. You can and you will," he interrupted firmly but kindly. "You've been through enough. There are clean clothes in the chest. They were Elizabeth's. They might be a bit large, but they'll be more comfortable than what you're wearing." Julia wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking her. "Thank you, Preston, for everything." He stood and collected their plates. "There's a wash basin in the bedroom. I'll bring you some warm water." True to his word, Preston soon appeared with a steaming pitcher of water. He set it beside the basin on the dresser, then quickly retreated, closing the door behind him. Left alone, Julia surveyed the simple bedroom. A double bed with a handmade quilt, a wooden chest, a small window with gingham curtains. It was modest but immaculately kept. She poured the warm water into the basin and nearly wept at the luxury of being able to wash. Using the soap she found nearby, she cleaned away days of dirt and fear, feeling almost human again by the time she finished. In the chest, she found women's clothing as promised. Selecting a simple cotton nightgown, she changed quickly, her fingers fumbling with unfamiliar buttons. Elizabeth had indeed been taller than her, and the garment hung loosely on Julia's frame, but it was clean and soft against her skin. Exhaustion hit her like a physical force as she sat on the edge of the bed. The events of the day, the auction, the rescue, the ride to this cabin swirled in her mind. Questions about what would happen tomorrow rose up, but she was too tired to ponder them. As Julia slipped beneath the quilt, She realized this was the first time in weeks she felt safe enough to truly sleep. Outside the bedroom door, she could hear Preston moving quietly around the cabin, his presence a reassuring reminder that she was no longer alone in this wild, dangerous land. She was asleep within moments, dreamless and deep. Preston sat in the rocking chair long after the cabin had grown quiet, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The woman sleeping in his bedroom was a complication he hadn't anticipated when he'd ridden into town that morning. He'd acted on instinct, unable to stand by while another human being was sold like property. But now he had to figure out what came next. Julia Morgan was clearly educated, refined, a woman used to civilization, not the harsh realities of frontier life. She'd mentioned Boston. Was that where she needed to return? The thought of her leaving caused an unexpected tightness in his chest. Ridiculous, he told himself. He barely knew her. Yet something about her courage in the face of terror had touched him deeply. Preston added another log to the fire, watching as flames licked at the dry wood. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow they would talk about her plans. For tonight, it was enough that she was safe. He stretched out on the sofa, pulled a blanket over himself, and closed his eyes, more at peace than he'd felt in years. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the windows when Julia awoke. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize where she was. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back: the auction block, Preston cutting her bonds, the ride to this cabin. She lay still, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackling of the fire in the other room. Slowly, she rose from the bed, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. The nightgown hung loosely around her as she moved to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The view took her breath away. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by rugged hills, with a stream glinting in the distance. The early morning sun painted everything in soft gold and rose. It was wild and beautiful in a way that made her heart ache. Julia found her tattered dress from yesterday and considered putting it back on, but the memory of standing on that auction platform in it made her shudder. Instead, she returned to the chest and selected a simple blue calico dress that looked like it might fit reasonably well. After dressing and attempting to tame her tangled hair with her fingers, she took a deep breath and opened the bedroom door. The main room was empty, but the fire had been built up and she could smell coffee brewing. Through the window, she spotted Preston in the corral with the horses. He was leading the chestnut mare they'd ridden yesterday, speaking to it in low tones she couldn't make out. Julia poured herself a cup of the strong coffee and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, so different from the stifling heat and dust of yesterday. Preston looked up as the door closed behind her. For a moment, he simply stared. With her hair loose around her shoulders and wearing his sister's blue dress, she looked like she belonged in this wild landscape. "Good morning," Julia said, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "I hope it's all right that I borrowed this dress." Preston nodded, leading the mare to the fence. "It suits you better than it ever did, Lizzie. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." He shrugged off her gratitude. "Hungry, I was about to fix some breakfast." Julia nodded, and they walked back to the cabin together, an unexpectedly comfortable silence between them. Inside, Preston moved efficiently around the small kitchen area, preparing a simple meal of flapjacks and bacon while Julia sat at the table, warming her hands around her coffee cup. "What will you do now?" Preston asked as he set a plate in front of her. "Do you have family back east?" Julia stared down at her food, the question bringing reality crashing back. "My parents died 2 years ago. I was a school teacher in Boston, but I received an offer to teach at a new school in San Francisco." Her voice faltered. "All my belongings were on that stagecoach, my clothes, my teaching credentials, what little money I had, everything's gone." Preston sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "The stage line might compensate you for your losses if you file a claim." "Perhaps," she said doubtfully. "But that would mean returning to that town, and she broke off, unable to suppress a shudder at the thought. "You don't have to go back there," Preston said firmly. "I can ride in and file the paperwork on your behalf." Julia looked up, surprised by his offer. You've already done so much, I couldn't ask for more. You didn't ask, I offered. He took a bite of his food, then added, besides, I need to go into town anyway. There's a telegram I need to send. A telegram? To the school in San Francisco. They should know what happened to their new teacher. Julia hadn't even thought that far ahead. Yes, I suppose they should. She hesitated, then asked the question weighing on her mind. How far is San Francisco from here? By stage, about 2 weeks if the weather holds and the Indians don't raid. Preston studied her face. Is that still where you want to go, was it? Julia wasn't sure anymore. The dream of teaching in San Francisco suddenly seemed distant and hollow compared to the nightmare she'd just survived. I don't know, she admitted. I have no money for passage, no credentials to prove I'm qualified to teach. I'm not sure they'd still want me. Preston was silent for a moment, considering. There's another option, he finally said. Silver Creek. Silver Creek, settlement about a day's ride from here, smaller than where we were yesterday, but decent folk. They've been looking for a teacher for their children. Hope flickered briefly in Julia's chest before doubt extinguished it. Without credentials, without references, you'd have mine, Preston interrupted. My word carries weight in Silver Creek. Julia stared at him, trying to understand why this man, still nearly a stranger, continued to help her. Why are you doing all this? Preston met her gaze steadily. Because it's the right thing to do. It was a simple answer, yet Julia sensed there was more he wasn't saying. Still, she couldn't deny the appeal of his suggestion. Silver Creek sounded far preferable to returning to the scene of her humiliation or attempting the longer journey to San Francisco. I'd like to consider it, she said finally, but I don't want to be a burden on your hospitality in the meantime. A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. You're no burden, Miss Morgan. Stay as long as you need to sort things out. They finished breakfast, and Preston showed Julia around the property. The barn housed not only horses, but a milk cow and some chickens. A vegetable garden stretched behind the cabin, surprisingly well tended for a bachelor's home. You're quite self-sufficient, Julia remarked as they walked among rows of corn and beans. Have to be out here. Preston bent to pull a weed that had escaped his earlier attention. Town's too far for regular trips. Don't you get lonely? The question slipped out before Julia could stop it. Preston straightened, his eyes meeting hers. Sometimes, he admitted, but I've found most people bring more trouble than companionship. Is that why you became a marshal? To keep trouble at bay, a shadow crossed his face. Became a marshal after Elizabeth disappeared, thought having a badge might help me find her. He looked away toward the distant hills. By the time I tracked down where she'd been taken, it was months too late. She'd died of fever in a mining camp in Nevada. Julia's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry. Preston nodded once, accepting her sympathy. Been wearing the badge ever since. Seems like the least I can do. They continued walking, and Julia found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. There was a quietness to Preston York that she found increasingly compelling. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his features too stark for that, but there was something undeniably attractive about his steadiness, his calm competence. I'll ride into town tomorrow, Preston said as they returned to the cabin. File that paperwork for you and send the telegram. Is there anything else you need while I'm there? Julia thought for a moment. Perhaps some paper and a pencil. If I'm to consider teaching again, I should start preparing lessons. Preston nodded. Consider it done. The day passed peacefully. Julia helped Preston with chores around the cabin, grateful for the distraction from her recent trauma. They worked well together, finding a natural rhythm that required minimal conversation. By evening, a comfortable familiarity had developed between them. After supper, they sat before the fire, the silence companionable rather than awkward. Preston whittled a piece of wood while Julia mended a tear in the blue dress she'd borrowed. May I ask you something? Julia said after a while. Preston looked up from his carving. Of course. How did you come to live out here so far from town? He considered the question, his knife pausing in its work. After Elizabeth, I couldn't bear to stay in our family home in Colorado, too many memories. His fingers resumed their skilled movement. Took the marshal's position out here, found this land, built this cabin with my own hands. A slight smile touched his lips. Turns out I prefer the company of horses to most people. Yet you're a lawman, Julia observed. That requires dealing with people at their worst. True enough. He examined his carving, a small horse taking shape from the wood. But it also lets me do some good now and then. Like rescuing a woman from being sold, Julia thought but didn't say aloud. Instead, she asked, "Have you always been in law enforcement?" Preston shook his head. "Ranched with my father before that. Still have a few head of cattle on the north pasture." "You're a rancher and a marshal," Julia was impressed. "Small ranch, just enough to supplement the marshal's pay." He glanced at her with a hint of amusement. "What about you, Miss Morgan? How does a Boston schoolteacher end up on a stagecoach to San Francisco?" Julia set her mending aside. "I wanted adventure, I suppose. After my parents died, there was nothing keeping me in Boston. When I saw the advertisement for teachers needed in the West, it seemed like fate." She gave a rueful laugh. "I certainly found adventure, though not the kind I was seeking." "The West has a way of testing people," Preston said quietly. "Some break, others become stronger." "And which am I?" Julia asked, suddenly needing to know how he saw her. Preston's eyes met hers across the space between them, their blue depth serious. "I've never seen anyone stand on that auction block with more dignity than you did, Miss Morgan. I'd say you're already proving your strength." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold since the stagecoach attack. "Thank you," she whispered. Preston nodded once, then returned to his whittling. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the furrow of concentration between his brows. Julia found herself wondering what it would be like to trace those features with her fingertips, to smooth away the worry lines etched there. The thought startled her with its intimacy. She was grateful for Preston's help, of course, but these feelings went beyond gratitude. It was too soon, too complicated. She had no place in her life for such thoughts, not when her future remained so uncertain. Yet as the evening progressed, and they eventually retired Julia to the bedroom, Preston to the sofa, she couldn't help but feel that somehow, in this remote cabin with this quiet, honorable man, she had found a sanctuary she hadn't known she was seeking. Morning came with a gentle rain pattering against the roof. Julia awoke to the comforting sound and lay still for a moment, enjoying the peace of it. In Boston, rain had often seemed an inconvenience. Here, it felt like a blessing. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Preston already dressed in his marshal's clothes, the star-shaped badge pinned to his vest. He looked different, somehow more formal, more distant. "Good morning," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "I'll be heading to town as soon as the rain lets up." "Will you be gone long?" Julia tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Should be back by nightfall," Preston replied. "Unless the creek's risen too high to cross." Julia nodded, sipping her coffee. "Is there anything I can do while you're gone?" "Nothing that needs doing. Rest." "You're still recovering." He hesitated, then added, "There are books on the shelf if you get bored. Not much of a collection, but might pass the time." Julia smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." They ate a quick breakfast, and by the time they finished, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Preston donned his hat and duster, checked his revolver, and headed for the door. "Preston," Julia called as he reached for the handle. He turned, and she found herself suddenly uncertain what she wanted to say. "Be careful," she finally managed. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something warmer. "Always am," he said softly. Then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Left alone, Julia explored the cabin more thoroughly than she had before. The bookshelf Preston had mentioned contained an eclectic mix: a Bible, some dime novels, a surprisingly well-worn copy of Shakespeare's collected works, and several books on law and ranching. She selected the Shakespeare and settled into the rocking chair, but found her attention wandering. Her gaze kept drifting to the window, though she knew it was far too soon for Preston to be returning. To distract herself, Julia decided to bake bread. She found flour and yeast in the kitchen and set to work, finding comfort in the familiar motions of mixing and kneading. As the dough rose, she explored the vegetable garden more thoroughly, gathering ingredients for a stew to accompany the bread. The domestic activities soothed her, giving her a sense of purpose. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was filled with the aroma of baking bread, and a pot of stew simmered on the stove. Julia felt a strange pride in creating this welcoming atmosphere. It had been a long time since she'd had a home to care for. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Julia found herself watching the trail that led to the cabin with increasing frequency. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving everything washed clean and glistening in the late afternoon light. When she finally spotted a rider approaching, relief flooded through her so intensely that it surprised her. She hadn't realized how worried she'd been until that moment. Preston dismounted in the yard, leading his horse toward the barn. Julia resisted the urge to run out and greet him, instead busying herself with final preparations for the meal. By the time he entered the cabin, she had composed herself. The scent of fresh bread and stew hit Preston as he stepped inside, stopping him in his tracks. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Julia stood by the stove, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing one of Elizabeth's old aprons over the blue dress. The table was set for two, a lantern casting a warm glow over everything. It was a vision of domesticity he'd never expected to find in his home, and it struck him with an almost physical force. "You've been busy," he said, removing his hat. Julia smiled, pleased by his obvious surprise. "I hope you don't mind. I thought you might be hungry after your ride." "Mind? No, he seemed at a loss for words. "It smells wonderful. Sit," she encouraged. "Everything's ready." Preston hung his hat and duster by the door, removed his gun belt, and washed his hands in the basin before joining her at the table. As Julia served the stew and cut thick slices of the still warm bread, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew several items. "For you," he said, placing them on the table beside her plate, a small packet of paper, 2 pencils, and a slender book. "What's this?" Julia asked, picking up the book. "Primer for the Silver Creek School. Thought it might help you prepare if you decide to take the position." Julia stared at him, touched beyond words. "You went to such trouble." Preston shook his head. "No trouble." He hesitated, then added, "I sent the telegram to San Francisco, and I filed a claim with the stage line for your losses." "Thank you," Julia said softly. Did you hear anything in town about the men who captured me?" A shadow crossed Preston's face. "They've moved on. Blackwell was asking questions about where I'd taken you." Fear flickered through Julia. "Do you think he'll come looking?" "No," Preston said firmly. "I made it clear what would happen if he did." There was steel in his voice that reminded Julia he wasn't just a rancher but a lawman accustomed to dealing with dangerous men. She nodded, reassured. "And the position in Silver Creek, is it still available?" "It is." "Town council meets next Wednesday. They'd like to meet you if you're interested." Julia considered this as they began to eat. The bread had turned out well, she noted with satisfaction, watching as Preston took a second piece. Would I stay here until then?" she asked hesitantly. Preston looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers across the table. "You're welcome here as long as you need, but if you'd prefer, there's a boarding house in Silver Creek." "No," Julia said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I mean, if it's not an imposition, I'd rather stay here." Something that might have been pleasure flickered across Preston's face before his expression returned to its usual calm. "It's no imposition." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the crackling of the fire. Outside, twilight deepened into darkness and the first stars appeared in the clear sky. "This is good," Preston said eventually, indicating the stew. "Best meal I've had in a long time." Julia smiled, pleased by the compliment. "It's the least I could do after everything you've done for me." Preston shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Julia." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Perhaps not," she acknowledged, "but I wanted to. It feels good to be useful again." After they finished eating, Preston insisted on helping with the dishes despite Julia's protests. They worked side by side in the small kitchen area, their movements carefully choreographed to avoid bumping into each other in the limited space. As Julia handed Preston the last plate to dry, their fingers brushed. She felt the contact like a spark of electricity, and from the way Preston's hand momentarily stilled, she knew he'd felt it too. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. Then Preston cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the moment. "I should check on the horses before turning in," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. Julia nodded, suddenly unable to trust her own voice. She watched as he donned his hat and stepped outside, leaving her alone with the confusing tangle of emotions he'd stirred within her. This attraction, she felt it was madness. They'd known each other barely 2 days. She was dependent on his charity, homeless and penniless in a land where she knew no one else. And Preston himself was something of an enigma, a man who lived alone by choice, who seemed to prefer solitude to company. Yet there was no denying the connection that had formed between them. As fragile and tentative as it might be, Julia moved to the window, watching as Preston crossed the yard to the barn, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit landscape. Whatever these feelings were, she decided, they would have to wait. She had more pressing concerns: rebuilding her life, securing a position in Silver Creek, finding her place in this wild territory. Still, as she prepared for bed later that evening, listening to the quiet sounds of Preston settling on the sofa in the other room, Julia couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he hadn't stepped away from that moment in the kitchen. The next few days fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Preston tended to his ranch duties during the day while Julia helped around the cabin and began preparing lessons for the school in Silver Creek. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, learning each other's stories piece by piece. Julia told Preston about growing up in Boston, about her parents' encouragement of her education, about her years teaching children from the city's wealthier families. Preston, in turn, shared tales of his childhood on a Colorado ranch, his close relationship with his sister Elizabeth, and how he'd tracked outlaws across 3 territories during his years as a marshal. Each revelation brought them closer, building a foundation of understanding and respect. Yet both carefully maintained a certain distance, aware of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. On the 4th day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Preston broached a subject they'd been avoiding. "The town council meets tomorrow," he reminded her. "If you still want to pursue the teaching position." Julia nodded, her hands stilling on the mending in her lap. "I do. We should leave at first light then. It's a good 4 hours ride to Silver Creek. Will you?" "Will you stay for the meeting?" Julia asked, hating the hint of vulnerability in her voice. Preston's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Of course. My word won't mean much if I'm not there to give it." Relief washed through her. As much as she'd prepared for this opportunity, the thought of facing strangers alone after her recent ordeal was daunting. "Thank you," she said softly. Preston nodded once, then returned his gaze to the sunset. "Silver Creek's a good town," he said after a moment. "Families mostly. Some miners, some ranchers. They're building something decent there. You sound like you know it well." "I do. Helped establish the law there when the Silver Strike first brought people in. They wanted me to settle there permanently as sheriff, but—" He trailed off, gesturing to the landscape around them. "Prefer my solitude." Julia studied his profile, wondering about the life he'd chosen. "Don't you ever get lonely out here?" Preston was quiet for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Used to think loneliness was a fair price for peace. Now I'm not so sure." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning Julia wasn't sure she was ready to interpret. Before she could respond, Preston stood abruptly. "Should turn in early if we're riding at dawn," he said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone. "I'll see to the horses." As he walked toward the barn, Julia remained on the porch, her thoughts in turmoil. Was Preston suggesting that her presence had changed his perspective on solitude? And if so, what did that mean for her plans? She had come to the West seeking a fresh start, and Silver Creek offered that opportunity. Yet the thought of leaving this cabin, leaving Preston, filled her with an unexpected sadness. In just a few days, his quiet strength had become something she relied upon, something she valued more than she cared to admit. That night, as Julia prepared for bed, she paused at the bedroom window. The moon was nearly full, casting a silvery light over the valley. In its glow, she could make out Preston's figure, standing alone by the corral, looking up at the star-filled sky. For a moment, she was tempted to go to him, to acknowledge the unspoken connection growing between them. But what would she say? What could she offer a man who had already given her so much, expecting nothing in return? Instead, Julia climbed into bed, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring a new challenge, a step toward building her future. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was Preston's face that filled her thoughts and the memory of his words. Now I'm not so sure. The journey to Silver Creek began in the hushed light of dawn. Preston had saddled 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a gentle Palomino mare for Julia. Though she'd had little experience riding before coming west, Julia had proven a quick learner during their daily excursions around Preston's property. They rode side by side when the trail allowed, Preston occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local history. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape changed, the rugged hills giving way to a broader valley dotted with small ranches and farms. Silver Creek, Preston said eventually, gesturing toward a collection of buildings nestled against the base of a mountain range. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, Julia could make out people moving about the main street, her stomach tightened with nervousness. After days in Preston's peaceful cabin, the prospect of facing a town full of strangers was daunting. As if sensing her anxiety, Preston said quietly, "They're good people, Julia. Nothing like the town where I found you," she nodded, drawing strength from his reassurance. "Tell me about the school. New building, finished last spring, about 20 children of various ages." Preston glanced at her. "They've been making do with the preacher teaching basic reading and numbers, but they want better for their children. And the council, who will I be meeting with? Mayor Thornton, who owns the general store, Reverend Hayes, Mrs. Whitaker, who runs the boarding house, and Mr. Jenkins, who has the largest ranch in the area and 3 school-age children." Julia committed the names to memory as they descended into the valley. By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, her initial nervousness had been replaced by determination. This was her chance to rebuild, to create the new life she'd sought when leaving Boston. Silver Creek proved to be a tidy, well-established settlement. Unlike the rough mining town where Julia had faced the auction block, this community showed signs of permanence and prosperity. The buildings were solidly constructed, the streets relatively clean, and the people they passed nodded respectfully to Preston. "Marshal York," several called in greeting. Their curious glances at Julia were friendly rather than predatory, a welcome change from her previous experience in the territory. Preston led them to a modest 2-story building with Silver Creek Hotel painted across its facade. "We'll stable the horses here," he explained as he dismounted. "The council meets at noon in the back room of the general store." After seeing to the horses, Preston suggested they visit the school so Julia could see it before the meeting. They walked through town, Julia taking note of the various establishments: a bank, a barber shop, a dress shop, the promised general store, and even a small newspaper office. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple white clapboard building with a bell tower. Inside, rows of desks faced a teacher's desk and blackboard. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they were sparsely filled. "It's lovely," Julia said, running her hand along one of the desks. "So much potential." Preston watched her from the doorway, something warm in his gaze. "They've set aside funds for more books and supplies, just been waiting for the right teacher." Julia turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed by all he'd done to bring her to this opportunity. "Preston, I don't know how to thank you," he shook his head. "No need. You'll be doing these children a service with your knowledge." "Still," Julia insisted, crossing the room to stand before him, "not many men would have done what you did. Not just rescuing me, but believing in me, helping me find a new start." Preston's eyes held hers, and for a moment, Julia thought he might say something significant. Instead, he simply nodded. "We should head to the store. Council will be gathering soon." The meeting took place in a spacious room behind the general store. Mayor Thornton, a portly man with friendly eyes, presided over a table where the other council members were already seated. Preston introduced Julia to each member, his hand resting supportively at the small of her back. The touch was light but gave her courage as she faced their scrutiny. "Miss Morgan comes highly recommended," Preston concluded. "I can personally vouch for her character and education." "We value your judgment, Marshal," Mayor Thornton said, "but naturally we have some questions for Miss Morgan." For the next hour, Julia answered their inquiries about her teaching experience, her educational philosophy, and her plans for the Silver Creek School. With each response, she grew more confident, reminded of her passion for teaching and her ability to connect with both children and adults. "What brought you to our territory, Miss Morgan?" asked Mrs. Whittaker, a stern-faced woman with shrewd eyes. Julia hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about her ordeal. Preston's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to hers on the table. "I came west seeking new opportunities," Julia said carefully. "The journey was more eventful than I anticipated, but thanks to Marshal York's intervention, I've found my way to your community." Mrs. Whittaker's eyes flicked between Julia and Preston, noting their proximity. "And your relationship with the Marshal is?" "Mrs. Whittaker," Preston interjected, his voice carrying a note of warning. "It's a fair question," the older woman insisted. "We're considering entrusting our children to Miss Morgan's care. We should understand her circumstances fully." Julia straightened her shoulders. "Marshal York rescued me from a difficult situation and has kindly provided temporary shelter while I sought employment. Our relationship is one of friendship and mutual respect." Her words were entirely truthful, yet they felt somehow inadequate to describe the complex bond that had formed between them. Mayor Thornton cleared his throat. "Well, I believe we've heard enough to make a decision." He looked around at the other council members, who nodded in agreement. "Miss Morgan, we would be pleased to offer you the position of teacher at Silver Creek School, beginning with the fall term next month. The salary is $40 per month, with accommodation provided in the rooms above the schoolhouse." Relief and joy swept through Julia. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I accept, and I promise I'll do my very best for your children." "Excellent," the mayor beamed. "Mrs. Whittaker will show you the teachers' quarters after our meeting concludes. I believe you'll find them quite comfortable." The remaining details were quickly settled. Julia would begin teaching on September 1st, with 30 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. The town would provide basic supplies, but she was encouraged to develop her own curriculum based on the needs she observed. As they left the general store an hour later, Julia could hardly contain her excitement. "I did it," she said, turning to Preston with shining eyes. "I actually did it." Preston's smile reached his eyes, softening the usual seriousness of his expression. "You did. They'd have been fools not to hire you." "I couldn't have done it without you," Julia insisted. "You give me too much credit. The position was yours on merit." They walked toward the hotel, where Mrs. Whittaker had arranged to meet them for the tour of the teachers' quarters. As they passed the dress shop, Julia paused, a sudden thought occurring to her. "I'll need proper clothing," she said, more to herself than Preston. "I can't teach in borrowed dresses." Preston followed her gaze to the shop window, where several ready-made dresses were displayed. "The stage line's compensation should arrive within a week or two. Until then." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small pouch. "Consider it an advance on your salary." Julia shook her head. "You've done too much already." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Preston interrupted, echoing his words from their first night at the cabin. He pressed the pouch into her hand. "Buy what you need. Pay me back if it makes you feel better once your own funds arrive." Their fingers touched during the exchange, and again Julia felt that inexplicable spark between them. From the way Preston's gaze intensified, she knew he felt it too. The moment was broken by Mrs. Whittaker's arrival. "Ah, there you are," the older woman said, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Ready to see your new home, Miss Morgan." The teachers' quarters proved to be a pleasant surprise, 2 rooms above the schoolhouse, simply but adequately furnished, with windows that overlooked both the town and the mountains beyond. There was a small bedroom, a sitting room with a stove for cooking and heating, and even a bookshelf, currently empty but promising. "It's perfect," Julia declared after the tour. Mrs. Whittaker nodded, satisfied. "We want our teacher comfortable. When do you plan to move in?" Julia glanced at Preston, who had remained quiet during the tour. I'm not sure. I'll need some time to prepare to acquire necessities." "No rush," Mrs. Whittaker assured her. "The rooms aren't going anywhere. Though I must say, Marshal," she added, turning to Preston, "it's unusual for a single man to provide lodging for an unmarried woman, even under special circumstances." Preston's expression didn't change, but Julia noticed his jaw tighten slightly. "Miss Morgan's reputation is above reproach, as is mine." Of course," Mrs. Whittaker said hurriedly. "I meant no offense. It's just that people talk, and in a small community like ours." "I understand your concern," Julia interjected diplomatically. "Perhaps it would be best if I moved into these quarters sooner rather than later." The older woman nodded approvingly. "Very sensible. The boarding house could accommodate you in the meantime if needed." "That won't be necessary," Preston said, his voice firm. "I'll bring Miss Morgan and her belongings to town when she's ready, not before." Mrs. Whittaker looked as though she might argue, but something in Preston's expression dissuaded her. "As you wish," she said instead. "Well, I'll leave you to look around a bit more. Good day to you both." After she departed, silence fell between Julia and Preston. He stood by the window, looking out at the town, his expression unreadable. "She wasn't entirely wrong," Julia said quietly. Preston turned to face her. "About what?" "The impropriety of our arrangement." "I hadn't considered how it might appear to others." "Does that matter to you?" There was a hint of challenge in his voice. Julia considered the question seriously. "As a teacher, yes. These people will be entrusting their children to me. I need their respect and confidence." Preston nodded slowly. "Then perhaps Mrs. Whittaker is right. You should move here sooner rather than later." "Yes," Julia agreed, though the word tasted bitter somehow. "It would be the sensible thing to do." They stood facing each other in the small sitting room, the future suddenly more complicated than it had seemed an hour ago. Julia had achieved what she'd hoped for a teaching position. A fresh start, yet the prospect of leaving Preston's cabin, of no longer sharing those quiet evenings by the fire, filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. "Julia," Preston began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. "Yes," she prompted. When he didn't continue, he shook his head slightly. "We should head back. It's a long ride and we're losing daylight." Julia nodded, pushing aside her disappointment. Whatever Preston had been about to say, he'd thought better of it, and perhaps that was for the best. Their lives were moving in different directions now, her to a new position in town, him back to his solitary existence in the hills. As they mounted their horses for the journey back to Preston's cabin, Julia tried to focus on her achievement rather than the growing ache in her heart. She had survived a terrible ordeal and secured a respectable position doing work she loved. That should be enough. Yet as they rode side by side through the golden afternoon light, she couldn't help but feel that something precious and unexplored was slipping away from her, as surely as the sun was slipping toward the horizon. The ride back to Preston's cabin was quieter than the journey to Silver Creek had been. Both were lost in their thoughts, the implications of the day's events settling around them like the dust stirred by their horses' hooves. As they crested the final ridge before the valley where Preston's property lay, he reined his horse to a stop. Julia halted beside him, following his gaze to the cabin below. In the fading light, it looked especially welcoming, a haven of peace in the wild landscape. "What is it?" Julia asked when Preston remained silent. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the scene below. "I built that cabin thinking I'd live there alone for the rest of my days," he finally said. "Never expected to share it with anyone." Julia's heart quickened at his words. "And now?" Preston turned to look at her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "Now I'm not sure I want to go back to that solitude." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Julia struggled to find the right response, aware that they stood at a crossroads. "Preston, A distant sound interrupted her hoofbeats approaching from the direction they'd just come. Preston's expression immediately shifted to alertness, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Get behind me," he said quietly but firmly. Julia obeyed, fear replacing the warmth of the moment before. Within seconds, 3 riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even in the dim light, Julia recognized the heavyset figure in the lead. "Blackwell," she whispered, terror gripping her heart. Preston nodded grimly. "And 2 of his men." His voice remained steady, but Julia could feel the tension radiating from him. "When I tell you to, ride for the cabin, fast as you can. There's a rifle above the door, get it and bar the entrance." "I won't leave you alone against 3 men," Julia protested. "You will," Preston insisted. "Because I can't protect you and fight them at the same time." Before Julia could argue further, the 3 riders drew closer. Blackwell pulled his horse to a stop about 20 yards away, close enough for his features to be visible in the fading light. His face was twisted in a smug smile that sent shivers down Julia's spine. "Well, well," he called, "if it ain't the Marshal and his fancy woman, been looking for you too." Preston's voice was ice cold when he responded. "You're trespassing, Blackwell. Turn around and ride out while you still can." Blackwell laughed, an ugly sound that echoed across the ridge. "Don't think so, Marshal. See, I paid good money for that woman before you stole her." "I aim to collect what's mine." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Preston said, his hand still resting on his gun, "least of all to scum like you." The insult wiped the smile from Blackwell's face. "You cost me money and reputation, York. I'm taking both back tonight." Preston shifted slightly, positioning himself more firmly between Julia and the 3 men. "Julia," he said quietly, "get ready to ride." "But now, Julia," Preston drew his revolver in one smooth motion as Julia dug her heels into the Palomino's sides. The mare leapt forward just as the first shots rang out. Julia bent low over the horse's neck, urging it down the slope toward the cabin. Behind her, she heard more gunfire, but she didn't dare look back, focusing instead on reaching the safety Preston had directed her to. As she thundered into the yard, Julia practically threw herself from the saddle and ran for the cabin door. Inside, she immediately spotted the rifle Preston had mentioned, mounted on hooks above the entrance. She grabbed it with trembling hands, then turned to secure the door. Through the window, she could see the ridge where she'd left Preston. Flashes of gunfire illuminated the darkening landscape, but she couldn't make out individual figures. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Julia forced it down. Preston was counting on her to defend the cabin. Checking that the rifle was loaded, Julia positioned herself near the window, ready to provide covering fire if needed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she strained to see what was happening on the ridge. Finally, a single rider appeared, galloping toward the cabin. In the dim light, Julia couldn't tell who it was. She raised the rifle, her finger tense on the trigger. As the rider drew closer, relief flooded through her. It was Preston, hunched slightly in the saddle but still upright. Julia rushed to unbar the door, the rifle still clutched in one hand. Preston dismounted stiffly as she ran into the yard. "Are you hit?" she asked frantically, noting the awkward way he moved. "Grazed my side," he admitted. "Nothing serious. Blackwell's dead, one of his men too. The 3rd ran off." Julia's eyes widened at the matter-of-fact way he delivered this information. "Come inside. Let me tend to you." Preston nodded, allowing her to help him into the cabin. Once inside, he sank into a chair while Julia lit lamps and gathered supplies to treat his wound. "Need to see to my horse first," Preston said, attempting to rise. Julia pressed him back into the chair. "The horse can wait 5 minutes. You're bleeding." Preston subsided, watching as Julia efficiently gathered water, clean cloths, and the whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. She'd learned where everything was kept during her days in the cabin, moving now with purpose despite her lingering fear. "Take off your shirt," she instructed, setting the supplies on the table beside him. Preston raised an eyebrow at her authoritative tone but complied, wincing slightly as he pulled the blood-stained fabric away from his side. Julia gasped softly when she saw the wound, a deep furrow across his ribs where a bullet had carved its path. "You call this a graze?" she asked, her voice shaking. Preston glanced down at the injury as if seeing it for the first time. I've had worse. That doesn't reassure me, Julia muttered as she began cleaning the wound. Preston hissed when she applied the whiskey-soaked cloth, but otherwise remained stoically silent as she worked. The bullet had indeed missed anything vital, passing through the flesh along his ribs without penetrating deeply. Still, it needed stitching to heal properly. Julia had assisted with minor medical procedures at the school in Boston, but this would be her first attempt at treating such a wound herself. I need to stitch this, she told Preston, meeting his eyes steadily despite her nervousness. He nodded once. There's a sewing kit in the dresser drawer. Needles been kept in spirits. Julia retrieved the kit, her hands shaking slightly as she threaded the needle. This will hurt, she warned. Preston's lips quirked in a faint smile. I trust you, Julia. The simple declaration steadied her. Taking a deep breath, Julia began the meticulous work of closing the wound. Preston remained still throughout the procedure, his only reaction an occasional tightening of his jaw when the needle pierced particularly sensitive flesh. When she finished, Julia bandaged the area carefully, her fingers lingering perhaps longer than necessary on Preston's warm skin. She became acutely aware of their proximity, of his bare chest rising and falling with each breath, of the strength evident in his lean frame despite the injury. Thank you, Preston said softly when she finally stepped back. Julia nodded, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. I should see to your horse, she said, turning toward the door. Preston caught her wrist, stopping her. Julia, wait. She turned back slowly, her pulse quickening at his touch. Yes. Blackwell's dead, Preston said, his expression serious. But that doesn't mean you're safe. His kind have friends, associates. Word will spread about what happened here tonight. Fear flickered through Julia. What are you saying? I'm saying that Silver Creek might not be far enough away. Preston's fingers tightened slightly around her wrist. I'm saying that you might never be entirely safe in this territory, not with your connection to me, Julia frowned. Are you suggesting I shouldn't take the teaching position, that I should leave the territory altogether? No. Preston released her wrist, then slowly stood, wincing slightly at the movement. I'm asking you to marry me. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and momentous. Julia stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? She finally managed. Marry me, Preston repeated, his voice firmer now. As my wife, you'd have protection, legal and practical. No one would dare touch you. Julia took a step back, confusion and hurt washing through her. Protection, is that all you're offering? Preston's expression shifted, a flash of vulnerability crossing his features before he controlled it. No, he admitted quietly, that's not all. Then what? Julia pressed, needing to hear him say it. Preston ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. I'm not good with words, Julia, not about things like this. Try, she insisted. Please. He met her gaze directly, his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. I've been alone a long time, thought that's how I wanted it. Then you came, and suddenly the cabin felt like a home again. He paused, searching for words. The thought of you leaving. It feels like losing something I didn't know I needed until I found it. Tears pricked at Julia's eyes. Is that love, Preston? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. If it isn't, it's the closest I've ever come to it. Julia's heart swelled with emotion. It wasn't a poetic declaration, but it was honest, and from a man like Preston York, honesty was worth more than flowery phrases. I think, she said carefully, that I might be falling in love with you too. Relief and joy transformed Preston's face, making him look younger, lighter. He reached for her hand, drawing her closer. Then marry me, Julia Morgan, not just for protection, but because I want to build a life with you. What about Silver Creek, the teaching position? Take it. We'll make it work. I can ride in to see you. You can come home on weekends. And next year, maybe we can find a place closer to town. Home. The word resonated through Julia. Preston's cabin had indeed become a home to her in the short time she'd been there. The thought of returning to it, of building a life there with him, filled her with a warmth that drove away the lingering fear from the confrontation with Blackwell. Yes, she said simply. I'll marry you, Preston York. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, rare and beautiful. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Preston lowered his head toward hers. Their lips met in a tender, searching kiss that quickly deepened into something more passionate. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I should still see to my horse," he murmured, though he made no move to release her. Julia laughed softly. "Your horse can wait a little longer." In answer, Preston kissed her again, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her closer. Julia went willingly, all thoughts of horses, teaching positions, and proper appearances forgotten in the joy of finding love in the most unexpected place. Later, as they sat before the fire, Preston's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, Julia marveled at the twists of fate that had brought her here. The terrible ordeal of the stagecoach attack and auction block had led, improbably, to this moment of contentment. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. Julia smiled, nestling closer to him. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best." Preston pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm just grateful I found you in time." "She belongs with me," Julia quoted softly. "That's what you said at the auction." "And I meant it," Preston replied, though I didn't fully understand how much, not then. Julia lifted her face for another kiss, her heart full. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, explaining their engagement to the town council, planning their wedding, figuring out how to balance her teaching position with their life together. But for tonight, it was enough to be here, safe in the arms of the man who had risked everything to save her and then, unexpectedly, had saved himself in the process. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the Silver Creek Church, a simple ceremony attended by the town council and a few other residents who had quickly come to appreciate Julia's warm personality. Preston wore his best suit, the marshal's badge polished to a shine on his chest. Julia wore a new dress of pale blue silk, purchased with the compensation that had arrived from the stage line just in time. Reverend Hayes presided, his kind face beaming as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Preston kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the small gathering, led enthusiastically by Mayor Thornton. The town council had been surprised by the sudden engagement but ultimately supportive, especially after Preston explained, in carefully edited form, the danger Julia had faced from Blackwell and his associates. Mrs. Whittaker, in particular, had transformed from skeptic to staunch ally, declaring that nothing was more proper than marriage. Their living arrangements required some adjustment. During the week, Julia stayed in the teachers' quarters above the schoolhouse, dedicating herself to her 28 students who quickly came to adore their new teacher. On Friday afternoons, Preston would ride into town to bring her home to the cabin for the weekend. These reunions became the highlight of both their weeks. Preston would arrive just as school was dismissing, and the children would wave excitedly to Miss Julia's husband, fascinated by the quiet Marshal who wore a gun and a star-shaped badge. Julia would gather her things, say goodbye to her pupils, and join Preston for the ride home. Those journeys back to the cabin, with Preston's arm secure around her waist as they shared the same horse, were filled with conversation about the week's events and comfortable silences that spoke of their deepening bond. The cabin itself began to transform under Julia's influence. Curtains appeared at the windows, a colorful quilt replaced the plain blanket on the bed, and bookshelves gradually filled with volumes ordered from back east. Preston built additional furniture, a rocking chair sized perfectly for Julia, a larger table where they could share meals and she could grade papers. By the time winter arrived, blanketing the landscape in snow, they had settled into a rhythm that suited them both. The cold months brought an end to Julia's weekend. Commutes the mountain trails were too treacherous, so Preston relocated temporarily to Silver Creek, renting a small house near the school. The separation from his beloved ranch clearly chafed at him, but he never complained, understanding the importance of Julia's work. On the first truly warm day of spring, as they rode back to the cabin after the long winter away, Preston surprised Julia with news. "I've been thinking," he said as they crested the familiar ridge overlooking the property. About our arrangement. Julia glanced over her shoulder at him, a flicker of worry passing through her. Oh, it's not fair to you, spending all week in town alone. I'm hardly alone, Julia protested. I have my students and the other teachers, and you know what I mean, Preston interrupted gently. A wife should be with her husband. Julia couldn't disagree with that. Despite her love for teaching, the nights in the small quarters above the schoolhouse had grown increasingly lonely as her love for Preston deepened. What do you suggest? Preston guided their horse down the slope toward the cabin before answering. I've purchased land closer to Silver Creek. 20 acres with good water access about a mile outside town. Julia twisted in the saddle to look at him fully, surprise evident in her expression. You're giving up the ranch, not giving it up, Preston clarified. Just expanding our options. We'll keep this place for summers and holidays. But I'm building us a proper home near town where you can teach and I can still have some space to breathe. Tears welled in Julia's eyes at this tangible evidence of his love. Preston York, who had valued his solitude above all else, was willing to compromise that most cherished aspect of his life for her happiness. When were you planning to tell me this? She asked, trying to sound stern despite the emotion clogging her throat. A rare grin crossed Preston's face. Thought I'd surprise you. Construction starts next month, should be ready by the time the fall term begins. Julia laughed, overcome with joy. You impossible man, she said, reaching up to touch his cheek. I love you so much. Preston turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. Love you too, he said simply. More than I thought possible. As they approached the cabin that had become their first shared home, Julia reflected on how far they'd come from that terrible day at the auction block. Preston had cut her bonds and declared that she belonged with him, words spoken to protect her in the moment, but which had proven prophetic in ways neither could have imagined. That night, as they lay tangled together in their bed, Julia shared news of her own. I have a surprise for you too, she whispered against Preston's chest. He stroked her hair lazily. What's that? Julia propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at his beloved face in the moonlight streaming through the window. You'll need to make the new house a little bigger than planned. Preston's brow furrowed in confusion. Why's that? Because, Julia said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach, by Christmas, there will be 3 of us. Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes, followed swiftly by wonder and joy. A baby. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Julia nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. A baby. Preston pulled her down into a kiss that conveyed everything words could not: his love, his gratitude, his awe at the life they were creating together. When they finally parted, he kept her close, his strong arms encircling her protectively. When I saw you on that auction block, he murmured against her hair, I never imagined this, never dreamed we could find such happiness after such darkness. Julia pressed closer to him, savoring his warmth and strength. That's the miracle of it, isn't it? How the worst day of my life led me to you to this. Outside their window, the vast Arizona sky sparkled with stars, witnessing their joy as it had once witnessed their first meeting. From bound and frightened captive to beloved wife and mother-to-be, Julia's journey had been one of unexpected twists and profound transformation. And Preston, the solitary marshal who had once believed loneliness was the price of peace, had discovered that true peace came only in the arms of the woman he loved, the woman who belonged, not to him but with him, now and always. Years passed, and the York family flourished. Their home near Silver Creek became a center of community life, with Preston serving as sheriff, a position that kept him closer to home than his marshal duties had, and Julia continuing to teach until their 3rd child arrived, at which point she reluctantly retired to focus on raising their growing family. Elizabeth, their firstborn, inherited her mother's intelligence and love of learning, devouring books as quickly as Julia could provide them. Thomas, who arrived 2 years later, had his father's quiet strength and keen observational skills. And little Sarah, the baby of the family, combined both parents' best qualities with a streak of independence that both challenged and delighted them. Summer visits to the original cabin became a cherished family tradition. Preston taught the children to ride, fish, and respect the wild beauty of the land, while Julia filled the evenings with stories and songs. The isolated property that had once been Preston's solitary refuge transformed into a place of joyful memories and family bonds. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting that fateful day at the auction block, Preston and Julia returned to the cabin alone, leaving the children with Mrs. Whittaker, now a doting honorary grandmother to the York children, for a few days. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, much as they had in those early days, Preston took Julia's hand in his. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Coming west, despite everything that happened, Julia considered the question seriously, as was her way. "No," she finally said. "How could I regret the path that led me to you, to our children, to this life we've built?" Preston nodded, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Sometimes I still can't believe you chose to stay with me. That you saw something worth loving in a weather-beaten lawman who hardly knew how to speak of his feelings." Julia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You spoke clearly enough when it mattered. She belongs with me." Those were the first words of hope I'd heard in days. "I didn't know then that I was really saying I belong with her," Preston admitted, "but that's the truth of it. You made me whole, Julia. You and the children, you're everything I never knew I needed." As darkness fell around them and the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Julia York reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terror of being bound and sold to the joy of building a life with the man who had freed her, every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to reach this place of profound contentment. "I love you, Preston York," she whispered, turning her face up for a kiss, "today and always." His lips met hers with the same tenderness they had shared on that first night, a decade ago. Some things had changed. There were a few more lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but the essential Preston remained the same, steadfast, honorable, and completely hers. "And I love you, Julia York," he murmured against her lips, "more with each passing day." Together they sat in the gathering darkness, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds, bound now not by ropes, but by the enduring ties of love, family, and a shared destiny that had begun with an act of courage on a dusty auction block in the wild Arizona territory.